Hello my crafty friends, this is Monica from Allsewpetite. In this video I will show you how to sew double folded bias binding and single folded bias binding on a straight edge. So if this is something you would like to learn, then keep on watching. The quickest way to sew double folded bias binding is to unfold it once. Keep the other shorter ends folded and place the edge of the fabric inside. So you're basically wrapping the edge of your fabric with bias binding so it looks exactly the same on both sides. What you need to pay attention to is that one side of your bias binding is longer than the other because the fabric is folded slightly off center. This way, when you wrap the edge of your fabric and stitch it from the top, it is easier to catch it on the other side. I like to mark it so I know which side of my bias binding is the shorter side. This is the side that I need to keep it on top when I'm sewing. So you're going to open it and place the edge of your fabric inside. Make sure to place the edge of your fabric against that crease. Then use some clips or pins to hold it in place. Now take this to the machine and top stitch the bias binding from that shorter side, about 2 millimeters from the edge. Keep your stitching consistent to have a nice finish both on the front and back. You can also use a single folded bias binding to create a similar finish. This time you need to unfold one side and place your bias binding on top of the fabric. So the right side of the bias binding is facing the fabric. Align those raw edges and clip them together. Take this to the machine and following that crease, you're going to stitch the binding in place. Whenever you are sewing bias binding, try not to stretch it out. Instead, lay it flat on top of your fabric. This way, when you finish, you don't have any puckering and your fabric doesn't shrink and ripple. Once you've got that stitched, you're going to flip the bias binding to the top, just along that stitching line. Then flip the entire piece to the other side. If you want, you can press that with an iron or finger press it like me. Then you're going to take the other side that is still folded, fold the binding in half and align that folded edge just beyond the stitching line. You don't want to see that stitching line. Just like that. And clip that in place along the entire edge. Now you're going to stitch it from the top, close to the fold. Make sure your previous stitching line is slightly covered and keep the same distance throughout. As you see, I've got this stitched and the front and back of my binding looks very neat. As long as you are consistent when sewing, your stitching line will look great on both sides. If you want your bias binding to be invisible from the right side of the project, there is an alternative way of sewing the single folded bias binding. To start, you're going to unfold the bias binding on one side and place the right side on top of the right side of your project. Align it at the edge and clip it in place. When you are ready, take this to the machine and again you're going to stitch along that crease. Once you've got that stitch, you're going to flip the binding away from the fabric the same way you've done it previously. Then flip the entire panel to the other side. Now, instead of folding the binding in half, you're going to fold it entirely to the bottom. You are basically folding the fabric just at the edge of the binding, where the stitching line is. I like to take it to the pressing station and press that seam flat. Now you are going to take this to the machine and top stitch the other side of the binding about 2 millimeters from the edge. So when you flip it to the other side, the right side of your project, you cannot see the binding. The binding is only visible from the wrong side of the fabric. If you want to learn how to make your own bias binding, then watch this next video. See you next time! Stay crafty, friends!